Stop scrolling. The woman he threw out in labor just walked in owning his empire. Cameras fired like summer hail as Emma Parker crossed the threshold of the Bennett Global Gala, and the room's chatter collapsed into a hush that made chandeliers sound alive. She didn't stride like a conqueror or shrink like a scandal. She moved with the practical calm of someone carrying documents that weigh more than applause. Mark Bennett, groomed in midnight satin and smiling for stability, felt his smile lose its scaffolding one muscle at a time. Vanessa's manicured hand found his sleeve, the warning in her grip hidden beneath a diamond's tremble. Board members who made careers out of predicting the weather of money glanced at Evelyn Torres, who did not glance back. Evelyn stood like a metronome set to evidence. From the balcony rail, a junior editor whispered, "Is that Emma?" And the photographer beside him forgot to breathe. Emma's dress was deliberate, elegant, unshouting, a shade that made the gold room look expensive instead of the other way around. In her left hand, a slim document case. In her right, nothing at all, because tonight she would hold the room with empty hands until the papers spoke. A quartet stuttered, found a polite loop, and stalled there as if music could wait on paperwork. Security didn't move. They were watching Evelyn, and Evelyn nodded once, not to clear a threat, but to welcome a shareholder. Emma paused beneath the central chandelier, the one patterned like a winter blossom, and lifted her chin by a degree you could measure with a ruler. The crowd tried to read a speech on her face and found only arithmetic. She thought of a stairwell with cracked paint, a taxi that didn't ask questions, a nurse who had said, "You're safe, keep going." She let that memory dissolve and kept going. Mark stepped forward to intercept, then backward to pretend he hadn't. His drink tilted, then steadied in a hand that had never learned to hold anything heavy unless it came with applause. "We're hosting strays now," he said to no one in particular, auditioning cruelty for microphones already reconsidering his voice. He expected a performance. She brought procedure. Vanessa's smile sharpened into geometry. The donors nearest the aisle leaned, ready to claim they had always been on the side of whatever this became. Emma did not look at Mark. She looked at the lectern as you look at a task you will finish, set the case on its edge, and rested two fingers on the clasp. Somewhere in the human animal there is a reflex that remembers scroll and seal. The room felt that reflex and grew reverent in spite of itself. She took the measure of faces she knew only as headlines and holiday cards. Men who believed philanthropy purchased absolution. Women who believed taste replaced ethics. Columnists who rented sympathy by the column inch, and saw them blink in the same surprised rhythm. Evelyn stepped toward the dais, stopping not in front of Emma, but exactly beside her. The choreography of acknowledgement so simple it felt radical. "Miss Parker," she said, voice even, as if calling a meeting to order. The microphones, loyal to signal alone, leaned in. Mark laughed softly, the sound a brittle chocolate shell over air. "Let's not ruin a party." Emma turned at last, not to answer him, but to scan the exits as any competent leader does in any crowded room. Her gaze returned to the lights, then the cameras, then the stack of paper that had required patience in months and courage in minutes. She pictured Mr. Hawthorne's neat ink, the trust's iron-clawed spine, the timestamps that made rumor irrelevant. She pictured her daughter sleeping like a proof in a quiet room. She pictured the door that had once closed on her pain, and then she pictured this door open. No one would remember her first breath on that stage, but she would. Steady, owned, debtless. Vanessa's phone buzzed uselessly inside a jeweled clutch. A violin found one note and held it like a wire. Mark's jaw moved with the old habit of command and produced nothing shaped like authority. Emma raised her eyes, and the cameras did what cameras do when they finally find the subject. She pressed her palm once against the case, not to steady herself, but to bless the work, and exhaled, as if setting a stone beside a river. The hush did not break. It deepened, waiting to be taught. A single violin found a thread and held it. Emma lifted her eyes to the room that had been a rumor mill, and with a voice made of daylight, began the story that ends with signatures and starts with truth. She did not hurry.
The night everything changed did not announce itself with thunder. It arrived as a quiet, relentless pressure that rose and rose until Emma Parker leaned her palm against the stairwell wall and understood her child was coming whether anyone shows kindness or not. And when she knocked on the apartment door and Mark Bennett opened it only wide enough for his expression to fit through, the first thing he offered her was impatience. He glanced at her belly, at the suitcase by the frame, at the way pain made speech hitch into her breath, and his mouth curled like a man tasting something he could not sell. "Hospitals take taxis," he said, sliding the suitcase into the corridor with two careful fingers, and when she tried his name the way a drowning hand tries a rung, he set the latch and closed the door with the finality of someone filing a task as completed. The next contraction took her knees. The brass rail caught what he would not, and across the hall a neighbor in a robe peered out and asked if everything was okay in the tone of a person asking the weather to be polite. "A cab, please," Emma managed, and the woman disappeared, returning with a phone held like a shield and news of 10 minutes, 10 being a scripture of its own when pain measures time in threes. Outside, street lights hummed, indifferent. The taxi arrived with a sigh, and the driver, seeing what he saw, said nothing louder than, "Hospital?" and drove with his hands soft on the wheel like gentleness could be a lane. In triage, a nurse looked once and knew everything necessary. Belts found a heartbeat, and the room filled with proof that refused to argue with rumor. Between waves, Emma's phone trembled. Unknown numbers, opinions dressed as concern, someone insisting Mark had done his best, and she turned the screen face down, the way you turn a picture frame toward the wall when the story inside it is a lie. Hours tunneled. Dr. Ortiz introduced herself and steadied the room with competence. The nurse stayed at Emma's shoulder like a promise that didn't need to be shouted. A social worker asked about family, and Emma said, "Not tonight," and meant both the evening and a history. When the door opened again and her mother stepped in with perfume too sweet for fluorescent light, the air thinned. Margaret folded herself onto a chair as if the fabric might judge her, and announced that Mark had called, that stability required decisions, that perhaps temporary guardianship would be sensible until you're settled. And the nurse's hand pressed once on the mattress, a wordless "I'm here," that pulled Emma back from the old gravity of being the child who was always too much. "Please leave," Emma said, steady enough to surprise herself. And when Margaret gathered her purse like a shield and retreated with a remark about ungrateful daughters, the room felt larger, as if square footage could be measured in the absence of contempt. When the push came, it came like weather, unbargainable. Emma bore down and then again, and the cry that broke the air stitched her back to herself. They placed the baby on her chest, warm, outraged, perfect, and time reduced itself to a single simple job: be here. Later, a volunteer offered a photograph, and Emma said yes, because witnesses can be paper as well as people. And the image captured a tired woman and a small pink hat and the particular light that belongs to mourning after survival. She washed her hands at the sink, caught her reflection, pale, swollen, unbroken, and reached into the fabric pouch she kept beneath important mattresses and felt her father's letters at the creases the way a talisman keeps its shape even in the dark. If life ever makes you doubt yourself, remember who you are. You already have a name, the looped handwriting said, and she stood breathing until the sentence settled into bone. Discharge brought clipboards and questions. Emma wrote the pediatric appointment in a borrowed planner and packed the small blanket with reverence. Outside, the city performed its ordinary morning show: trash trucks, steam, phones at crosswalks. While inside the elevator, she touched her daughter's cheek and understood that dignity would henceforth be a practical chore done daily. The apartment greeted her with a silence that had learned to imitate safety. A borrowed bassinet stood ready. Rent notices pretended to be mail. The neighbor knocked to offer soup and the kind of talk that does not pry. Emma slept in breaths, woke to feed, and then, when the baby slept again, slid a wooden chest from beneath the bed and unfolded the documents she had memorized but kept secret from a world that called her unstable because it was easier than calling her inconvenient. A trust, ironclad, built by a father who had understood that daughters inherit not only money, but the risk of men who think access is love. She did not tremble. She underlined dates and tabbed pages. She wrote Hawthorne and Co. on a sticky note, then a Tuesday, then a time. Pride would want spectacle. Wisdom would prefer sequence. And she chose wisdom because the nurse had said, "You're safe, keep going," and because the heartbeat monitor had been louder than every lie put in her mouth. On the first grocery run, a woman with pearls discussed Mark's resilience into her phone while Emma compared unit prices. At the laundromat, two neighbors performed pity with a side of gossip. At night, she sewed hems that paid a fraction and learned that thread can be a meditation when you refuse to let it be a metaphor for survival. She filed her edges, not as apology, but as preparation. Short courses online during naps, a spreadsheet that treated cents like seeds, a list of vendors who respected invoices more than rumors. When she finally called Hawthorne's office and heard a receptionist say his name as if it belonged to an ordinary professional rather than a lifeline, Emma felt something radical in its plainness. She was not a miracle. She was a process. By the time Tuesday arrived, she had a child care plan, a bus schedule, and a folder that did not shake in her hands. Mark's social media offered curated happiness. Vanessa's ring sparkled like a press release. Margaret sent a single text, "Are you done being dramatic?" and received nothing back. The city did not care either way, which was its own permission. Emma buttoned her coat, kissed her daughter's forehead, set the photo from the hospital on the table like a witness who would not testify but would attend, and stepped into a morning that did not know it was making room.
Emma arrived at Hawthorne & Co. on a rain-clean morning, the city's edges sharpened, and the lobby smelling faintly of paper and polish, and when Mr. Hawthorne ushered her into a book-lined office with windows that made the skyline look like a ledger, he treated her not as a roomer in need of sympathy, but as a client in need of a plan. He did not ask for a story, he asked for documents. And Emma placed the trust deed on the table, the schedule of assets, the notarized letters her father had drafted to lock the doors against men who confuse proximity with entitlement. And Hawthorne read in silence before tapping one clause with a capped pen. Separate property preserved in perpetuity, ironclad as a vault wall, and said, "It holds," with the mild satisfaction of a mechanic hearing a well-tuned engine. Then outlined the road. New accounts, quiet custodians, accumulation by inches, no drama, no breathless edge, just patient arithmetic that turns into control when the careless finally look up. The word control did not make Emma giddy, it made her methodical. So she walked through the steps twice, asked for contingencies, and accepted a 2-page timeline that replaced vengeance with sequence. She left the office lighter in the way a person feels after learning the name of a tool they have always needed. Crossed to a discount coffee shop where a barista drew a heart she did not notice, and opened a spreadsheet that treated cents like seeds. Naps were for the baby, nights were for coursework, financial statements, governance basics, the choreography of a board meeting, and between shifts she built a map of vendors and allies, the ones who respect invoices more than gossip, while the world around her continued its loud theater. Mark Bennett curated resilience on social media and curated bids in the boardroom, snapping at assistants, smoothing at donors, calling headwinds what the charts named choices. And Vanessa, newly fluent in the grammar of glass rooms, smiled beside him and learned to read the tremor in his hands as another kind of index. Pressure seeped in at the edges. A supplier renegotiated terms until cost volatility stabilizes. A lender added a covenant that spoke softly and carried a big stick. An analyst flagged unusual accumulation from opaque vehicles. And Evelyn Torres, who understood that panic begins where clarity ends, asked for a private briefing with legal, then called Hawthorne to test a hunch without announcing one. Because leaders do not guess in public, they confirm in private. Elsewhere, Emma pushed a stroller to the public library and printed monthly statements she had already memorized, made 3 small purchases through 3 separate vehicles, measured risk with unromantic caution, and learned to breathe past the urge to swing for headlines when patience buys permanence. Margaret phoned once to revisit the theater of concern, offered a list of relatives willing to help the baby land somewhere stable, and Emma, folding tiny clothes that already showed a life being lived, said only, "We are stable," and hung up with the clean mercy of a door that fits its frame. At the laundromat, 2 women performed pity with commentary, and Emma decided their voices were environmental noise, like train brakes and squeaky carts, neither enemy nor counsel, just sound you walk through. Hawthorne's email cadence became a metronome, executed, settled, confirmed, each verb a tile in a quiet floor, and as the positions grew past quaint toward consequential, he recommended a second meeting with a governance specialist. Emma arrived early, took notes as if knowledge were water, and practiced the 3 sentences she would one day need on a stage where cameras mistake volume for truth. Control has transferred. Operations will continue. Evidence is available. Meanwhile, Vanessa set her jaw in a smile that wouldn't chip and learned which rivals lounged in which hotel bars, where whispers carried differently. She told herself she wasn't betraying Mark so much as refusing to be the last one to learn anything. And when Whitmore asked what she wanted, she said a landing, not a crash, and sent redacted supplier schedules in the kind of message you cannot quite forgive yourself for even as you hit send. In board packets, graphs stopped lying for anyone. Revenue tilted, confidence mirrored it, insurance premiums hiccuped, resignation letters arrived with language about family time. And Mark, who believed in force where patience lives, slammed a fist against the table whose wood did not care, and barked about saboteurs, while Evelyn said, "Show me the cash position," in a tone that collects facts the way a shoreline collects tides. Out in the city, Emma bought a second-hand blazer that fit like a sentence finished properly, put her daughter's photo in the inner pocket, and made a list called What We Keep. The letter, the deed, the frequency of small kindnesses, the nurse's hand, the cabbie's soft question, the neighbor's soup, and a list called What We Don't. Apologies to people who enjoyed being cruel, explanations offered to mouths that only chew. By the end of the quarter, a percentage threshold approached like the edge of a harbor, the kind you look at ordinary until you notice the lighthouse has changed its blink. And Hawthorne suggested a reveal not in a courtroom with its appetite for spectacle, but in a gala with its appetite for narrative, because markets are human, and humans understand theater. And Evelyn, who favored light over rumor, kept the gala on the calendar as a signal that the ship still sails. Emma booked childcare, booked a car, booked a stylist with the simplest brief, quiet power, and walked through the building with Hawthorne the afternoon before, learning where the screens would breathe, where the lights would land, where a speaker stands when truth has to compete with chandeliers. And when she tested the clicker and watched the deed, the ledgers, the resolutions broom across empty seats, she thought not of revenge, but of relief. Tomorrow, the evidence would say what gossip never could, and the nurse's sentence, "You're safe, keep going," would at last have a room big enough to hear it. On the morning chosen to steady a faltering story with velvet ropes and champagne flutes, Emma Parker woke before the city's buses yawned into motion, stood at the window of her small apartment, and let daylight verify what resolve had already decided. Today would not be loud, it would be clear. She fed her daughter, labeled tiny containers for the sitter, slipped the hospital photo into the inner pocket of a second-hand blazer she would not wear tonight but needed to touch, and reviewed the checklist Hawthorne had printed in tidy fonts: final confirmations, custodian notices, proxy assignments, board resolution language trimmed of vanity, then called the car service and repeated the address slowly as if accuracy were a spell. The sitter arrived with warm hands and the calm of people who know babies rather than merely admire them.
Emma knelt to eye level, set out a book with chewed corners, and whispered the promise she always whispered, a simple, "back soon," that meant more now than it had when life was only survival. Across town, a stylist pinned an understated gown while reminding her that power is often the quietest person in the room. "No spectacle," Emma said, and the stylist smiled like a professional hearing a correct diagnosis. In a different mirror, Mark Bennett rehearsed lines in an immaculate tuxedo, jokes to charm, numbers to soothe, a story to place over cracks like gold leaf, while his phone jittered with messages from departments that had learned to pad bad news in euphemisms. He silenced them and posted a photo of cufflinks engraved with initials and captioned it with a resilience quote someone else had written. Vanessa, who had learned the physics of proximity to power, scheduled her smiles by the quarter hour and checked a separate phone for a 3-word reply from Whitmore, "Received, thank you," before tucking it into a clutch that glittered like a bribe. She told herself insurance is not disloyalty, only realism. Evelyn Torres arrived at the venue early, walked the floor with the quiet competence of captains counting life vests, and checked the staging, not for drama, but for line of sight to documents. She did not like surprises, but she respected their utility when shaped by facts. Hawthorne stepped through the service entrance carrying a case that looked ordinary and was not. Backstage, he reviewed with Emma one last time the order of proof, the escalations to avoid, the sentences that hold like scaffolding when flashbulbs try to wobble them. Control has transferred, operations continue, evidence is available. And Emma repeated them until they felt like muscle memory instead of courage. By noon, vendors rolled in crates that smelled faintly of citrus and starch. Florists elevated white arrangements that would appear in hundreds of unearned alibis on social media, and a quartet tuned strings in a corner where gossip would later dress as culture. Outside, the press set up rails, cameramen jockeyed for sightlines, and a junior reporter practiced a segment that began, "Despite rumors," as if rumor were a polite cousin of fact. In the Bennett Global offices, a risk officer drafted a memo about liquidity that would make sense to anyone willing to read past the third sentence, but that memo would arrive after the hour when narrative overtakes spreadsheets. Mark ignored the calendar invites labeled private and replaced them with a public schedule that looked like confidence, then called an old friend in the press and fed him a quote about weathering storms, a metaphor he favored because it suggested storms are acts of God rather than patterns of choices. Emma rode the elevator at the venue with Hawthorne, the numbers blinking up between floors like a pulse. In the green room, she clasped and unclasped her document case with a tenderness that had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with work. Then checked her phone for a single text from the sitter, "All good, someone is snoring like a tiger," and breathed out a smile only her hands saw. Security received new instructions worded with courtesy, not suspicion. They were not to bar Emma's path, but to clear it when the signal came from Evelyn's small nod, a choreography of legitimacy. Vanessa paused at the top of the marble stairs, took a photograph angled to catch both chandelier and ring, and posted it with a caption about gratitude that worked like perfume, overwhelming to the wearer, faint to everyone else. She noticed Mark's hands trembling when he fastened his watch, and decided to be grateful for the way cameras can't record a pulse. The board filtered in 2 by 2, their conversations curved around sports and travel until they reached Evelyn, whose eyes turned small talk into agenda. She spoke the words continuity, fiduciary, and vote like tools, not threats, and men who had survived markets by pretending to like risk remembered suddenly why they admired her. Somewhere in the quiet of an office where no one would think to look, Whitmore reviewed the contracts Vanessa had sent and smiled the way a man smiles when gravity begins to tilt in his favor. He sent a message to a buyer 3 time zones away and marked a date in a journal he did not intend to share. The doors opened to donors, the ice chimed in crystal, the quartet found a pleasing loop. Mark began his rounds with the bounce of a man used to applause, and Emma watched him only once, not to injure herself on memory, but to measure the distance between what he sold and what she would show. "You're ready," Hawthorne said without drama, and Emma thought of a stairwell, a heartbeat on a monitor, a nurse saying, "You're safe, keep going," and recognized that every corridor had led to this threshold. She adjusted one cuff, aligned the folder's edges, and stepped toward the light as Evelyn moved to meet her, two trajectories engineered to intersect at the exact point where rumor surrenders to paper.
The room tilted toward silence the instant Evelyn Torres lifted her hand, and in that held breath, Emma Parker stepped into the wash of stage light, set her document case on the lectern with a tactful thud, and proved there is a difference between spectacle and evidence. She did not clear her throat or rehearse for pain. She opened the case, pressed a single button on a clicker, and the walls bloomed with records, dates, custodian stamps, transaction IDs, small purchases laddering into a position no rumor could dismiss, while Hawthorne, a half step behind, stood like a certification seal in a suit. "Good evening," Emma said, voice steady enough to flatten gossip. "I'm here to correct the record." And Mark Bennett, chest angled toward cameras, attempted a chuckle that sounded like a glass set down too hard. "We can discuss this privately." But the word privately arrived late to a room that had already learned new vocabulary: control, transfer, fiduciary, because Evelyn read from a folder with the soft emphasis of a judge. As of close of business yesterday, majority ownership is consolidated under Miss Emma Parker's vehicles. The board's resolution recognizing this transfer is signed and effective. And on the screens, the trust deed enlarged, its iron language glowing like a pane of daylight, separate property preserved in perpetuity, beyond marital reach. "My father anticipated men who confuse love with leverage," Emma said without heat. "He built a fence I kept locked." And the quartet in the corner, trained to fill awkwardness, let their bows hover in midair, deciding to let the proof make its own music. She clicked again, and the slope of charts replaced the sentiment. Revenue lines honest now, debt covenants annotated, supplier notes that began to fray in the month Mark called bad weather, and the numbers called unforced errors. She did not narrate failure, she narrated continuity. Operations continue, teams remain in place, contracts will be honored. The difference is stewardship. And something in the donor's faces loosened under the relief of an adult voice. Mark stepped closer, smile tightened into thread. "Emma, we don't have to do this here," he murmured, eyes flicking to the nearest camera as if to recruit it. But he misread the new choreography. Security did not drift toward Emma. They pivoted to a neutral posture that kept the lane between her and Evelyn clear, the quiet geometry of legitimacy. Vanessa sensed the shift the way birds sense pressure changes. She tried to lace her arm through Mark's and found his sleeve damp. She raised her chin toward the screens just in time for the next slide to land. Emails from Mark's account, redacted for addresses but not intent. His sentences parading a familiar arrogance. "Her father's money is real. If separate, I'll push dependency. She folds under pressure." And the murmur that moved across the marble was not outrage, it was recognition. People know this script and hate being caught reciting it. "Pulled pursuant to subpoena power granted by controlling owner," Hawthorne said mildly, to preempt the lie about hacking, no doubt rehearsing in Mark's mouth. And Emma did an unusual thing for a victor at a microphone. She did not gloat. "I will not litigate my marriage in public," she said, "only my stewardship." And Evelyn, satisfied the room had learned the lesson, lifted the second folder, the vote, and read the line that travels farthest in a building full of cameras. Effective immediately, Mark Bennett is removed as Chief Executive Officer. An interim management committee led by Chair Torres will operate pending formal appointment. The sound that followed, press shutters, crystal, exhale, doubled as a market signal. Mark's eyes went bright and blank the way a screen goes when the cable pulls. "You can't," he started, then saw the signatures undercut the sentence.
Vanessa's fingers tightened around the clutch with both phones inside and the weight of the Whitmore thread stitched into it. And for a second, she believed she might pass through this light unscorched, because shame often runs slower than news, until the next slide arrived hurried by its own inevitability. A breadcrumb log of vendor contracts exported from her cloud to a rival's server 3 nights ago. Timestamps like fingerprints, subject lines like confessions. Someone near the dais whispered, "Oh," the smallest syllable in the human inventory and often the loudest. Vanessa's mouth found outrage too late. She said, "Fake," the vowel souring before it left, and Hawthorne, almost kind, let the chain of custody graphic finish her sentence for her. Emma did not look at Vanessa. She looked at the board, because that is where a leader looks in public, and said, "I'm not here to punish. I'm here to put guardrails back on the road." And something like respect moved through the group, the feeling professionals have when a situation that wished to be theater is forced back into governance. Mark, discovering how small a person feels when applause is not furniture, reached for an old lever and came up with air. "Emma," he said, and the syllables were both plea and habit. Think of, but she already was, the payroll she had reviewed at dawn, the vendor line item that could be renegotiated without bloodshed, the plant manager whose name she had written phonetically in her notes so she would not mispronounce it on first call. She clicked once more, not to wound, but to set every loose mouth in the city to silence. Bank confirmations of her vehicles, custodian letters, a letter from her father dated 10 years ago that ended with the line she had carried like a spine. "If they mistake your quiet for emptiness, let them. Emptiness makes room for the work." We begin audits in the morning. We end the habit of pretending volume equals vision. And Evelyn, who believed that mercy belongs to private rooms and justice to public ones, closed her folder and nodded to security in a way that communicated procedure, not humiliation. The quartet, relieved to have a cue, resumed something soft. Donors recalibrated in real time. A junior reporter whispered to his cameraman, changed the lower third from rumor to ownership. And Mark stood very still, absorbing the physics of not being the axis anymore. Emma reached for the document case, not to flee, but to mark the meeting done. She dipped her head once to Evelyn, once to the staff lined along the wall who would carry the weight of this moment tomorrow when headlines moved on. Then she looked out over marble and gold and said the only sentence she would allow herself that nodded toward the past without feeding it. "I survived quietly so I could lead clearly." And with that, the room, which had come hoping for gossip's sugar, found itself full of bread.
By dawn, the building smelled like toner and coffee and the aftertaste of a party that had discovered itself to be a meeting, and Emma Parker stepped out of the elevator with her document case and no entourage because the work did not need a parade. She met facilities at the badge desk, signed the temporary access register like any contractor who knows humility is efficiency, and thanked the woman who handed over a lanyard as if gratitude could be standard operating procedure again. Evelyn Torres was already in the war room, formerly a donor lounge, now a table full of printouts and open laptops, circling the 3-day plan on a whiteboard whose scuffs told stories about budgets. "Audit, cash, comms," she said, tapping each heading, and Emma nodded. The word comms reminded her that markets listen for verbs. Legal briefed first, crisp as autumn. Board minutes filed, removal notices served, litigation hold in place, chain of custody preserved for the export Vanessa had performed. HR followed with a quiet list of access changes at midnight. Mark's executive drive archived, his building privileges set to escort-only retrieval, his calendar delegated to ops. Emma listened without theatrics, asked for a 1-page memo that any floor supervisor could understand, and wrote 3 sentences herself at the bottom of the draft. "We are open. Your job is safe. We will tell you the truth, even when it is unflattering." PR wanted polish. She asked for plain. "No metaphors about storms," she said, and the agency rep, realizing the era of euphemism had ended, cut adjectives until the statement read like a valve opening. At 9, she and Evelyn joined finance in a glass room that overlooked a city, behaving as if none of this mattered. The controller walked them through liquidity with a pencil, because pencils slow bravado down, and flagged 2 covenants she called temperamental. Emma asked which vendors carried the most leverage and which carried the most gossip. They are not always the same, she said, and the controller smiled like a person recognizing a fluent accent in a new colleague. At 10, Emma dialed Henderson, the first supplier who had stepped back. "We'll honor prior terms for 2 quarters if you return capacity by Monday," she offered, not as a bribe, but as a bridge. And when he hesitated with an old rumor about chaos, she said, "You are speaking to the person who signs. I prefer paper to rumor," and the line cleared in his throat. At 11, she walked the floor with operations, learning names the last CEO had treated like disposable cups. Joy in receiving, who knows which pallets always tip, and Kellen in packaging, who fixes jams with a rubber mallet and a joke. A foreman named Aid, who showed her a bottleneck that could be solved with a different brake schedule and a spare sensor. She knelt to eye level with a line gauge, because leaders can lower themselves without losing altitude, and promised a part number by Thursday. When she stood, she wrote it on her palm as if memory needed ink, the way trust needs delivery. Meanwhile, Vanessa learned about consequences in a room without chandeliers. HR and legal sat opposite her, a recorder on the table, and asked for a statement. She asked for understanding and received policies. She asked for mercy and received process. Whitmore replied to her late-night plea with 6 words that were both forecast and epitaph. "Cannot assist. Recommend counsel. Good luck." And the absence inside those syllables felt larger than any ballroom. Margaret texted Emma at lunch with a sentence that tried to fuse apology and nostalgia. "Can we talk? I miss you." And Emma, eating a sandwich standing up at the window, replied with a boundary shaped like a doorframe. "Not yet. When I'm ready, it will be after you acknowledge what you did in words, not whether." Mark arrived under escort at 2 to collect the contents of his office. The receptionists made themselves busy with screens, as people do when they are too polite to stare. He lifted a photo he had once called his favorite and discovered it framed only his reflection. He took the fern, because plants don't testify. In the corridor he paused as Emma and Evelyn returned from a vendor call, and the air tightened with the old gravity of former intimacy. "Emma," he said, and the syllables came out like coins scraped off a floor. "I'm sorry," and it was the right word in the wrong era. Emma did not humiliate him. She did not rescue him either. "I hope you find a life you can live with," she said, the gentlest sentence she could afford, and kept walking, because mercy misapplied becomes maintenance. At 3, she met comms and legal again to finalize the employee letter. She removed the phrase "New Dawn" and replaced it with a schedule of town halls, payroll dates, and a link to an anonymous question form. Then she signed her name the way a person signs a contract with themselves. At 4, she rode to the distribution center on the edge of town in a company sedan that smelled like someone else's ambition, and stood in a high bay cathedral of shelves while a forklift operator threaded gold between aisles. She asked what broke and what wasted, and they told her. Inventories lagging by 2 days. Pickpath mapping from a software demo that never became a deployment. So she approved overtime for a weekend reset and texted Evelyn the word approved with a picture of a mislabeled bin for the board packet, because pictures change how distance thinks. By 5, the first trade outlet ran a headline that did not taste like sugar. Ownership transfer complete. Interim committee moves to stabilize, because comms had fed them facts, and facts, like bread, have weight. Near 6, she returned to the war room, checked boxes on a whiteboard that now looked less like triage and more like a route, and sat for the first time that day. In the tired quiet, Hawthorne set a cup of tea beside her and said nothing, which is a kind of vow. She opened her phone to a sitter's photo of a toddler asleep on a storybook, cheek stamped with a cartoon moon, and the world narrowed helpfully to that radius. Before leaving, she wrote one more line on the board beneath Audit, Cash, Comms, a fourth heading that would not fit in spreadsheets but belonged in governance. The room stilled around the word, as rooms do around new rules. Emma turned off the light, thanked the janitor by name, and stepped into evening, carrying no trophies, just tomorrow's list, inside today's grace.
The next morning, the company met its new gravity in a town hall that replaced chandeliers with fluorescent hum, and Emma Parker stood on the warehouse mezzanine beside Evelyn Torres and the interim committee, while pallets made a low skyline behind them. The mic clipped to Emma's collar, as if to remind everyone that leadership is sound carried clearly. She did not start with vision. She started with payroll dates, with vendor timelines, with the exact hour the weekend reset would begin and end. And when she said, "Your jobs are safe unless numbers, not rumors, say otherwise," shoulders dropped across 3 shifts like a pressure valve opening. Then she introduced the people who would actually keep lights on. Joy from receiving to lead the inventory reset, Kellen from packaging to co-design a new pick path with ops, Adele as floor liaison to the committee. Because naming workers in public is a kind of contract, and applause rose not as spectacle, but as relief. She explained that she would not be CEO. Governance would remain a fence, not a crown, and an external search would run while Evelyn's committee handled decisions by quorum, 3 signatures minimum for any change that touched product, people, or cash. Legal nodded because guardrails are their love language. Comms collected questions on cards, not microphones, to catch the shy truth. And the cards told the clean story. Are we selling the plant? Will benefits change? What happened to Mr. Bennett? Emma answered without contempt. The plant stays. Benefits stand. Mr. Bennett will not return to this building except as a guest. This is not punishment. This is procedure. Someone asked how she wanted them to treat the internet's noise. Let it pass through you, she said. And if you can't, bring it to us. I will not let you defend our work alone. When she finished, the applause felt earned. And afterward, she walked the floor again with a roll of blue painter's tape, flagging places where labeling had lost the plot. Because sometimes leaders fix a system by touching a shelf. Across town, Vanessa occupied a smaller room with no windows and 1 lawyer, reading her own cloud log printouts in a silence that showed her face to herself. Whitmore's number stopped answering. Her DM inbox turned from invitations to articles, and the old friends who adored proximity discovered calendar conflicts that repeated on Tuesdays and forever. Margaret arrived at Emma's apartment at noon with grocery bags and a speech about mothers doing their best, but the sitter met her at the door and said, kindly, that visits would be scheduled when accountability replaced apology-shaped air. Later, Emma texted a single line, "When you can write what you did plainly, I will meet you," and placed the phone face down, because boundaries are not doors slammed, but doors latched. Mark tried contrition on camera, in a Bay studio that makes every guest look equally sincere. He used the word journey, then the word hurt, then the phrase mutual mistakes, and the internet convened juries, but the markets did not. 2 partners who had wavered returned with terms Emma could sign without swallowing dignity. 2 who had watched for blood quietly stepped closer, and the headline window moved on, because it always does. In the conference room at 2, finance, ops, and legal reviewed a week 1 scorecard. Henderson back online. Covenant 1 negotiated to monitor rather than trigger. A small insurer offering better rates if the audit cleared in a month. A red block by a regional distributor who liked chaos as leverage. Emma wrote, "Call Wednesday," beside it and underlined. At 4, she and Evelyn met a short list of potential interim CEOs. An operations quietus from Milwaukee with 20 years of boring excellence, a turnaround celebrity whose aura cost money, a VP from inside whose slides were ugly but whose answers were clean. Emma asked each to describe a failure and what changed because of it, and only one answered without spin. Evelyn grinned like a person discovering the face of her next dissent-proof vote. Near dusk, Emma walked out to the loading docks, where dusk made a lake of the asphalt, and found Adele with 3 operators re-chalking a pick path by headlamp. She knelt, traced the chalk with a finger, and approved 5 meters of path change and 10 hours of overtime, because 10 well-placed hours prevent 50 wasted later. Adele nodded the way men nod when dignity is paid in time. At home, the sitter reported a day of towers built, bananas rejected, and a mysterious crayon line on a storybook moon. Emma laughed, set the grocery money on the counter, and tucked her daughter into pajamas printed with tiny cranes, the kind that lift without showing off. Then opened the laptop at the kitchen table and joined the investor call, where cameras stayed off and voices were mostly breath and spreadsheets. She repeated the 3 sentences she had practiced in Hawthorne's office. Control has transferred. Operations continue. Evidence is available. And then she added a 4th. Dignity is policy here, not charity. The line was quiet in the way people are quiet when they resist the urge to applaud into microphones. When the call ended, she set the laptop aside and took out her father's letter, not to be rescued by it, but to measure herself against it. His looped hand still said, "If they mistake your quiet for emptiness, let them. Emptiness makes room for the work." And she realized the room was full now, of work, of names, of lists with boxes turning into checks. She washed the day from her hands, washed the blue tape from her fingertips, and stood at the window where the city continued not caring and thus granting permission. She did not rehearse revenge or imagine losses for other people. She planned Wednesday, the distributor call, the censor arrival, the benefits Q&A, and the first interview block for the Milwaukee Quietus. Somewhere in that wide city, Mark rehearsed another apology, and Vanessa wrote a paragraph that started with, "I'm sorry," and kept wandering. And Margaret drafted and deleted sentences that could not find the word, "I chose him when you begged me." The world spun with its usual indifference and small mercies. Before sleep, Emma set the hospital photo back into the inner pocket of the blazer she had saved and smiled at the way the paper had begun to soften at the corners. Paper softens, she thought, but it still holds. Tomorrow would need all the ordinary strength she could carry. She turned out the light and let the dark be ordinary too.
Emma Parker learned that most endings arrive as a sequence of ordinary days rather than a trumpet blast, and in the weeks after the town hall, she kept choosing ordinary with surgical intent. She rode the dawn elevator with facilities to watch the night shift handoff. She ate standing lunches with the controller to translate covenants into plain English. She FaceTimed the daycare during breaks to hear her daughter narrate the weather with new words. And each evening she walked the floor, palms collecting ink from part numbers she promised to solve, and did. Henderson stayed. The temperamental covenant cooled to a monitoring note. The regional distributor who fed on chaos took her Wednesday call and found himself disarmed by a woman who refused to treat volatility as a personality trait. By Friday, he signed a bridge agreement that was boring enough to be safe. The interim CEO shortlist tasted like competence. The Milwaukee Quietists accepted after Emma asked only 2 questions: how he protected dignity during downturns, and whether he could live with a committee that vetoed flair. He smiled, said yes to both, and began Monday with a tour conducted by Joy and Kellen rather than by PR. Vanessa's story resolved in smaller rooms. Legal closed their binder with a clause that translated to severance for cooperation. She signed, left with a box of picture frames and a phone full of threads that no longer rang, and in the quiet heard herself admit what ambition had hidden, that Mark had been a mirror, not a partner. Margaret's arc bent more slowly. She wrote a letter, not a text, her loops strict and unpretty, naming the betrayal without weather metaphors. At a cafe on a Thursday that smelled like oranges and carpet cleaner, Emma read the words, "I chose him when you begged me," and felt a heat that did not need to spill. She set the letter down, looked out at a child dragging a backpack like an anchor, and said to herself that forgiveness would not be a return ticket, but maybe it could be a permission slip to stop rehearsing pain. She wrote back the next day, "We can have coffee with ground rules, no rewriting, no performance." Mark drifted toward consultancy the way men drift toward any shoreline they can name. He gave talks about resilience to rooms that liked the way the words sounded until numbers appeared. Once he sent Emma a sincere paragraph with no ask inside it, and she replied with a sentence that felt like a prayer for strangers. May you build a life you don't have to sell to yourself. In the company, small wins compounded. Ade's censor eliminated a bottleneck. Picking time dropped. The overtime bill shrank without rage, and the insurer shaved points when the audit landed clean. Emma hung the audit cover in the war room, not as a trophy, but as a receipt. PR discovered the news had lost interest in scandal, where process had replaced drama, and comms pivoted to a newsletter that made employees the heroes they already were. A photo of Joy's handwritten map taped to a column, Kellen's rubber mallet retired ceremonially, a spotlight on the night crew's fix-it cart labeled Saints. Investor calls acquired a new cadence, fewer adjectives, more verbs. Emma repeated her 4 lines until they were muscle memory. Control has transferred. Operations continue. Evidence is available. Dignity is policy. And then stepped back so the Milwaukee quietist can describe how boredom is a form of excellence when measured correctly. On a clear Saturday, the committee toured the distribution center with families invited. Toddlers rode pallet jacks like dragons, guarded by bored parents. Emma's daughter wore a paper crown from the craft table and announced that all forklifts were boats. Emma knelt to agree because it cost nothing to say yes to a kingdom of cardboard. That night, after the sitter carried a sleeping child to bed and the apartment quieted into the friendly hum of a refrigerator that needed no metaphors, Emma opened her father's letter and did not need it to stand. She read it like a photograph of someone already present. She took out the hospital picture, corners soft now from pocket miles, and slid it beneath a magnet on the fridge door next to a new snapshot from the town hall where Joy and Ade laughed mid-briefing. Paper softens, she thought, and still it holds, and people do too when the right weight is given to them. When dawn finally came in the way that it always does, quiet and certain, Emma stood at the window and watched the city being itself, indifferent enough to be generous. She made her tea, packed a lunch, wrote one last line on a sticky note for the war room, "We will be measured by the way people breathe at work," and tucked it into her case. The story of the woman thrown out in labor did not end with a crown. It ended with a schedule, a payroll run, and a company that trusted the floor more than the rumor mill. It ended with a mother who no longer rehearsed defenses, who wore steadiness like a uniform, and who, when asked by a young analyst how to survive cruelty without becoming it, answered simply, "Let evidence speak, and let mercy choose its rooms." And if the city kept telling itself other stories, as cities do, Emma did not argue. She placed her hand on the document case, as you might on a shoulder, and stepped into a day that did not need to be a miracle to be magnificent.